Hey, what's up guys, Robert here, and we're going to be talking about undoubtedly the most versatile bike in the Scott range, the Genius, here beside me. They have always let the Genius be kind of what you want it to be. It's always been quite pedal friendly, but still able to tackle fairly kind of aggressive terrain. And they've doubled down on that this time around. So with their same internal shock technology and integrated suspension technology, frame base with 150mm travel, a pair of 29-inch wheels and a 160mm fork, they are now offering the standard Genius or the Genius ST, the Super Trail, so that you can target either slightly more pedaling kind of friendliness with the standard Genius, or go up to the Super Trail, the light enduro model, for more focus on the aggressive descending performance. The integrated suspension technology on the new Scott Genius is there for a number of reasons. The first of which Scott is not afraid to admit is the look of it. So it obviously looks super unique. You may get the occasional comment of, is that an e-bike or what's happening there? But certainly there's no doubt that it is a stunning bike in the flesh. And on top of that, you get protection for the shock from the elements to keep it from running longer in theory. You get extra stiffness around the shock so that you don't get lateral forces on it that can be harmful or create stiction. And there's also reduced or lowered center of gravity, which should yield some increased performance out on the trail too. The integrated suspension technology is just a fairly standard horse link, except for the upper rocker arm has like a two-piece design to it, with the external link that you see on the frame there and an internal link connected by a clever spline system that Scott's very proud of in terms of its engineering, and then that drives the shock inside. So you get 150mm travel of horse link suspension, and Scott has kind of tweaked the kinematics there to be friendly and also to slightly kind of harness the track lock or twin lock suspension lockout systems that they use on these models, offer on these models, but we'll get onto that in a little bit. Kinematics, you've got roughly 110% of anti-squat at sag in the climbing gears, and then that increases slightly through the gear range to give slightly more pedaling support when you're giving it a little bit more body English and weight transfer in the harder gears. And then you have got progression of around about 21% through the shock's travel. So it's not a super progressive bike, but equally it should be quite happy taking some pounding with the standard air shock without, you know, absolutely filling it full of volume spacers there. To make adjustments to the shock, Scott has included a little removable hatch in the down tube, and because the shock adjustments on that nude shock that they've developed with Fox are in kind of a smart location, located on the top of the shock in easy access when you do open that hatch, I'd actually say it's almost easier to make adjustments on this thing than on some, you know, particularly complex multi-link bikes where the shock adjusters can be hidden behind links and stuff. So for those who are worried about tweaking their suspension and that it might be more difficult, I don't think you should worry there. One of the key differences between the Genius and the Genius ST is the lockout system that they use. So the standard Genius, as with kind of conventional Scott bikes from the past, uses a twin lock system which controls both the compression of the fork and shock simultaneously, as well as giving you the kind of nude ramp up chamber in that shock. So that cuts off one of the chambers of a two-chamber air shock to reduce the effective volume and increase the progression, meaning that you get slightly more support and platform to push off of when you go into the traction control middle mode of the twin lock system. Then when you add the climb mode, or go into the climb mode or lockout of the twin lock, everything's a lot firmer. You get quite a lot of compression damping in that rear shock, as well as add in compression to the fork to make it a really stiff and efficient platform to pedal on. The Genius ST, on the other hand, uses a track lock system. So this is designed to be more of a descending-minded bike, so it's only given slightly less extreme lockout system on it. It still makes quite a difference, but they offer only the lockout for the rear end, and the fork's left completely open so you can access all the adjustments on the fork. The Grip 2 damper in the case of this ST900 tune that I was testing. And the track lock system has a traction control middle mode, and then a climb and then a descend position. So the descend position, as you'd expect, is fully open, where you can make low speed compression and rebound adjustments independently to tune how that feels. Then you get the traction control mode, which closes off one of the chambers as well, but doesn't affect the compression damping, giving you extra ramp up and extra support. And then you go into the climb mode, and you've got the reduced air volume combined with some increased compression damping to give you the most kind of efficient platform of the three, but still not a super firm lockout. So even in the climb mode on this super trail version here, you can still ride relatively rough terrain without it being overly harsh and uncomfortable and losing traction. Scott offers a lot of different options when it comes to the build spec on their new Genius, be it the Genius or the Genius ST. There are models from 940, which is their entry level, through to the 900 tuned and the 900 Ultimate, which are their top tier models. The 940 has got a full alloy frame, and you should hit our YouTube channel and check out the video on how that's made, because that's super interesting, and they put a lot of work into that and a lot of detail. And yeah, it's certainly not just a cheap version, it's still a premium alloy frame, and it looks very much the same as this carbon frame as well in terms of its silhouette, which is quite impressive. Then they offer a HMF carbon and alloy rear triangle kind of mid-tier build, which is a blend of the two. And then you've got the full HMX carbon, super lightweight, kind of 2.25 kilos or so carbon frame that they use in their 900 models, their top tier models. And prices go from about $3,700, I believe, up to $12,000 or so for the 900 Ultimate in the standard Genius lineup. I tested the Genius ST 900 tuned here, which comes in about $11,000 or pounds. So certainly not a budget bike, but it's got a pretty premium components package there to match that price tag, which we'll talk about next. In the front of this Genius ST 900 tuned is a Fox 36 factory 160mm with the Grip 2 damper, with obviously all the adjustments you're able to make thanks to just the track lock system acting on the rear shock. And then there's the custom Fox Float X nude rear shock, co-developed with Scott and Fox to control that rear end, 150mm travel, with that track lock system that obviously gives you the three different modes. You've got a full SRAM Axis drivetrain with a X01 carbon crank and an X01 derailleur, and then the GX rocker shifter. You've got Shimano XTR M9120 brake set, 4 pistons with 203 front rotor and 180mm rear rotor. The Synchros Revelstoke 1.0 carbon wheels on this, which are pretty nice lightweight carbon option. They use DT Swiss hubs, so you know you're guaranteed quality there. And then a lot of kind of Synchros own brand components to finish it off, with the Synchros Hickson IC integrated cockpit. It's got 25mm rise on this extra large, 780mm wide, and then a 40mm long stem, and sweep that actually felt quite comfortable. The Synchros Duncan dropper post and a Synchros Tofino saddle. And then the wheels are wrapped in a set of Maxxis 2.6 inch wide exo casing tyres, a DHF in the front and a dissector in the rear, which were interesting and not necessarily what I think is the best for this bike, but we'll talk about that next in the ride impressions. Geometry on the Genius ST is much and such the same as the standard Genius, aside from the bikes do have a adjustable headset cup, so you get plus or minus 0.6 degrees with that, and the Genius ST, because it's a more aggressive bike, ships in the slacker headset position, whereas the standard Genius ships in the steeper one, so you get either the 65.1 degree of the standard Genius or the 63.9 degrees head tube angle of the Genius ST. This combines with a slightly size-specific seat tube angle, effective seat tube angle, which goes from about 76.7 degrees in the size small through to 77.4 degrees in the extra large, just to offset the difference in the saddle heights of different height riders. You've got a 33mm bottom bracket drop, kind of middle of the range reaches for these days, with the extra large I ended up testing coming in at 510mm, and then the large sitting at 485mm, which is, yeah, fairly typical. and then the rear end is consistent across the size range at 440mm. And rounding out the specs on this XL is a stack height that comes in at 654mm or so, so pretty tall, and then an overall wheelbase that's fairly long, about 1290mm. So certainly purposeful numbers. I did end up on the XL rather than the large that I would have preferred. It definitely didn't kind of ruin the experience for me, but we'll talk about that more in the ride impressions next. So then, how does the Scott Genius Super Trail 900 tuned perform? After the first ride, where we had a couple of days in Aosta in Italy, I was sort of left to think about my experience and yeah, kind of reflect on the couple of days riding that we had. And what I came to the realization of was that I'd certainly enjoyed the bike, but I hadn't been all that inspired by it. It felt good, but it didn't blow me away, and it didn't really make me feel like there was any particular need for that track lock system in there, because it pedals really efficiently as it is. But upon reflection, after giving it a little bit of thought, I kind of came to the conclusion, or certainly came to develop the theory, shall we say, that this thing might perform slightly better. It might justify the use of that track lock. It might be able to get some slightly increased descending performance out of it. If I was to set it up, not kind of a standard with like a 28 to 30% rear sag sort of setting, but instead setting it up with even more sag than that, around about the 35% range, the sort of figures that you would normally reserve for an out and out downhill bike, just to make it kind of sit into that travel more, give you all that compliance and traction that you want. But then you've always got that track lock system there that you can flick it up into to increase the pedaling performance and to make it more efficient for, you know, either be it the climbs or when you're sprinting hard on the trail. And then you'd have that middle mode in there as well, the traction, no, not the traction control, the ramp control in this one, sorry, where you'd be able to increase the progression. So if you're on a more jumpy terrain, when there's harder compressions, or you want more feedback and support from the rear end when you're pumping to get speed, then you'd be able to get that too. So in my head, all that kind of theorizing made a lot of sense, so I was very excited to get it into the trails of the Tweed Valley to put that theory to the test. And I'm happy to report that I think I am the genius, not the bike, because that kind of unlocked an extra level of performance that, yeah, that I wasn't quite able to get in Aosta in Italy, and I was certainly more happy with the bike set up like that. What I would say is that I kind of suggested in the opener there that it was a very versatile bike, and I think that's why I think it is an incredibly versatile bike, one of the most versatile that I've used, because you have the option there. You can set it up with the kind of Roberts special tune with the extra sag to make it a more downhill focused machine one day, but still not totally ruin its pedaling performance and its climbing prowess. And then the next day, if you're going somewhere a little bit more mellow, then you can set it up with slightly less sag and have it as more of an all-rounder feeling all the time, with even better pedaling support and efficiency for the most kind of pedal intensive portions of that trail. In terms of its climbing performance, whether it be in my special setup or the standard setup with like a 28-30% sag, it's a fairly competent climber, especially when you use that climb switch on the bar, the track lock in the climb mode. It really firms things up, not to the excess, but combining the extra compression damping with the ramped up increased progression of the air shock, you end up sitting slightly higher in its travel, and then you end up in a zone of the rear end where there's more anti-squat. So all around it's combining to give you more pedaling efficiency, and yeah, certainly it gives you just that. It is a nice and efficient climber, something I certainly would not shy away from a big day in the saddle on. And then also, because of that increased BB height that the higher dynamic position gives you with that lockout, as well as the resulting steeper head tube angle, it makes it more manageable. You know, this is quite a slack bike, quite a long bike, but once you use that track lock to give you that increased pedaling performance, that more kind of, yeah, climb oriented dynamic geometry, it makes it a much more, yeah, kind of agile and just more pleasurable climber all around. So you can take this to a trail center and ride some fairly, you know, tight and twisty and technical uphills without problem, but then when you kind of unleash a beast and stick it into the descend mode, it falls more towards the enduro category. I wouldn't say it's ever the most absolutely planted bike, but we'll talk about that when we talk about how it descends. In terms of the ultimate descending capability of this thing, certainly I would say that you need to replace the tyre spec for something more aggressive. The 2.6-inch tyres do give it some extra comfort, and I feel like potentially Scott has spec'd these to offset what is, you know, quite a stiff front end with that integrated cockpit, all carbon. Certainly not a super flexy unit. Pair of carbon wheels, which definitely aren't the flexiest that I've ridden. They're definitely more on the stiffer side. And then what is actually quite a nice stout frame, given its low weight. So all around it is certainly, yeah, something that you do need to chase a little bit of compliance out of, and I feel like Scott's maybe spec'd those tyres on it so that the less aggressive riders will still get enough comfort to be happy enough on the trail. Once I swapped these out for something that I think is a little bit more suitable, I had a set of Continental Total Enduro tyres on it at one point, had a set of WTB with a Judge and a Convict on there. And yeah, it's certainly, both of those more aggressive tyre combos felt a lot better with their natural kind of damping and their natural stability that the stiffer sidewalls offer. And really let me push this thing a little bit harder than as you see it here. Once you get something a little bit more appropriate wrapped around the carbon wheels, it's certainly a competent descender. Certainly especially in my more sag heavy approach of setup, you end up with a really nice and stable in the bike feeling, I'd say. The rear end moves pretty nicely and freely. It's definitely not absolutely up there with the coil sprung high pivot things, but it does a fairly good job at muting the trail, but it still gives you enough feedback, I guess, because it's quite linear in the grand scheme of things. It's not the most progressive bike out there. You can still feel, you know, plenty of what's happening below your feet, and it's generally all around a nice sort of stable, stiff enough, sturdy enough, confident enough bike through the hard compressions to let you push on a bit, but still, because of the low weight, it's still nice and agile, so you can get this thing airborne quite easily. You can dart it from corner to corner really nicely, and because the low BB, or the BB is quite low as standard, then you add my kind of setup to it, which drops it even further. You really are just like low and sunk into the bike, which feels fantastic for especially quick corners in succession, just like darting side to side with minimal effort, just like almost skiing the bike between them. And the rear end being 440mm long, kind of in the middle of the range, just means that you don't have to actively weight the front wheel quite so much. Of course, me being on the XL here, which is longer than I would normally test, it certainly helped with that as well, I'd say. But yeah, all around I think the geometry is pretty dialed, and the Genius is certainly a competent light enduro bike. I wouldn't quite say that it's worthy of being like an enduro racer's one and only bike that they use for sort of every kind of enduro race. It does certainly have a limit where you push through that 150mm travel, even in a kind of standard setup, and find the end of the travel before it gets to the absolute gnarliest of terrain. But it's certainly a competent descender all around, I would say, and one that's a huge amount of fun on a wide range of terrain. Again, kind of an ode to that versatility there. In terms of the component package and just generally maintenance and durability, the only issues that I've really had with this thing are the down tube cover. I managed to crack one of them just when a loose rock flew up and hit the down tube. It did its job and protected the shock and the carbon frame very well. There's no sign of damage at all from either of those. So once I got the new down tube cover on there, it was plain sailing and good to go as normal. And also I found that there's quite a lot of water is able to get into the frame when you're washing it. There's a couple of different ports around the bike. The seal around that down tube cover isn't very good. So you can certainly get some water up in there. So it's very much worthwhile, being careful not to pour water all over your garage floor when you're tipping it to try and get the water out post to wash. And yeah, also definitely worthwhile trying to tip it in all sort of different orientations to clean the water out of it and stop it from sitting in the frame and potentially causing damage. But that said, the bearings have all lasted really well. They're still as smooth as day one, so I don't think that there's necessarily water sitting around the bearings and causing them to rust or anything. So I don't think it's necessarily an issue for durability's sake. It's been a few months of very wet weather riding here, plenty of washing where a bearing would potentially start to go by that point. So definitely not something to be too concerned about, but something to watch out for all the same. And then in terms of the components, the integrated cockpit actually turned out to be okay. I normally hate them. I don't love the idea of them as a concept in general, but the geometry of this one felt about right for me. Certainly not exactly how I would choose to roll my own bar, but an absolutely acceptable level. The XTR brakes were fantastic, the Axis drivetrain was fantastic. The Synchros dropper post does rattle a little bit, which is quite annoying, but certainly performed, went up and down without any problems. And then the suspension's been a pleasure too. The wheels have even held up pretty damn well, not required much love with the spoke key at all after some fairly hard riding and some big hits, not necessarily to the carbon itself. I have been a little bit careful not to absolutely explode them. But yeah, certainly in terms of big compressions, a couple of sideways landings along the way, they've shaken it off without any problems. And it would just be that tyre spec there that I'd be looking to change as soon as I got the bike. And otherwise I think I'd be happy just to get on it and ride it. But you would hope so, because it's a lot of money, and if I'm honest, I don't think I could necessarily recommend somebody to spend this amount of money on a bike without a motor. Even a bike with a motor, it's a pretty tricky sell. But that said, I think the lower price models are of a slightly better value, on paper at least, and I'd imagine that, you know, with the same kind of engineering, the same level of detail in the frames, albeit a slightly heavier weight overall, they're still going to provide you with a very good performance package all around. So potentially I wouldn't say, unless you're really looking for the best, to go for the most expensive 900 ST tuned here, but certainly one of the lower spec levels could be certainly a bike that I recommend as an all-rounder for a lot of people. I hope you guys have enjoyed checking out this video. Do let us know your thoughts on this bike. Do you think we'll start to see more bikes with shocks hidden inside the frame in the future? I definitely think it's a really unique look, and something that I get a lot of comments on, both positive and negative. So let us know what you think about it, and if you would like to have one a bike with an internal shock yourself. Thank you so much for tuning in to the channel, guys. Do subscribe to the channel to see more awesome content on awesome bikes like this, and hope to catch you out on the trails. Thank you.